Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Today we're joined by Eugene Volokh, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and Distinguished Professor Emeritus at UCLA School of Law. He's taught the First Amendment, free speech, firearms regulations, and more. Before that, he clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor at the U.S. Supreme Court and Alex Kozinski on the Ninth Circuit. He is the author of textbooks like The First Amendment and Related Statutes and Academic Legal Writing, and the founder of the legal blog, The Volokh Conspiracy, shaping the national debate on free speech and civic life. You might also know his YouTube series, Free Speech Rules, where he dives deep into how free expression works in today's world. Professor Volokh brings grounded, thoughtful perspective on what free speech really means in our constitutional democracy and why it still matters so much. Professor Volokh, thank you so much for being here today. Today, we're talking about the part of the First Amendment that deals with freedom of the press. So for our listeners, what is freedom of the press?
So freedom of the press is the freedom of people to speak out using mass communication technology. It was originally, the press meant printing press. It was the freedom of people, whether they are professional journalists or just ordinary citizens, to use the printing press without the government demanding a license or the government punishing them for it and the like. Now it's, of course, been extended to the modern heirs, the printing press, such as the internet, for example. There are, of course, exceptions to the freedom of the press, as with the freedom of speech. So, for example, there's an exception for defamation, for libel, false statements, especially knowingly false statements about particular people or organizations that damage their reputation. There's an exception if you publish true threats of violence, if you put out leaflets that threaten someone's life. Also, the freedom of the press includes some amount of freedom to gather the news and not just to report it, although the exact boundaries of the freedom of news gathering are less well settled.
Can you, for our listeners, you talked about libel and defamation. What are those words mean?
So defamation means basically, I oversimplify here, but basically statements that are false, the factual assertions that are false and damaging to the reputation of a person or a company or a nonprofit organization. Often it requires that the statements be knowingly false or at least negligently false. Defamation is divided basically into two sorts. There's libel, which is written, and slander, which is oral. So that's an exception to the First Amendment, to defamation, that even though speech about people is generally protected, opinions about people are generally protected, true statements about them are generally protected, false statements that damage their reputation will, under many circumstances, be not protected by the First Amendment.
And then when you talk about gathering information, can you give us an example of how that is freedom of the press? Because I think of press as I read something in my newspaper or maybe online, but how do you mean by gathering information?
Right. Well, so if you want to read something or see something online in the newspaper or television, someone's got to put it out, right? And especially if it is, for example, a recording, someone has to record it. So, for example, there have been many cases recently, none from the U.S. Supreme Court, but from lower courts, and pretty unanimous on this, that say that people have the right to record public officials, especially, say, police officers, but not only, in public places, performing their public duties. So if a city or state has some ordinance or statute that limits people's ability to video and audio record, then that may very well violate the First Amendment rights of news gathering. And why? Why are such rights recognized? Because in order to have something to say, you have to be able to compose it. And if that thing that you're trying to say is here is the actual scene as we've captured it, or the actual statement as we've recorded it, you need to be able to record it.
So you talked about too, like, when this first started, it was really about utilization of a printing press. But now that we live in this really online world, what does freedom of the press mean for an online world?
Well, it means the freedom to use new mass communications technology. It's a very close cousin of the freedom of speech. The framers understood the freedom of speech as this traditional, long-standing, basic natural right to express your views. And of course, before the invention of the printing press, in order to do that, you had to talk to people. Maybe freedom of the press might have included writing things down by hand, but it wasn't a tremendously efficient way of communicating to large groups of people. Once the printing press was invented, over the centuries, the English and then eventually the Americans and many other countries as well, but our legal system descends to America from England, recognized that the freedom of speech ought to also include the freedom to use this new technology of the printing press, which is an especially effective way of communicating one's ideas and communicating facts. So that's how it emerged. Unsurprisingly, the exceptions, for example, for First Amendment protection are pretty similar for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You can't say things that damage people's reputation and are false state factual assertions. Generally speaking, again, I oversimplify here. Likewise, you can't write them. You can't write threats of illegal violence against people. You can't print them. You can't tweet them out. Likewise, you can't say them. So the freedom of speech and freedom of the press are both facets of the freedom of communication, the freedom to express your views, to convey ideas, to convey facts.
Are there any, for people who are interested in freedom of the press, are there any Supreme Court cases that really stick out to you that you think, for just somebody who's like, this sounds really interesting, I'd like to know more maybe about what the Supreme Court has said?
I think there are lots of books out there about freedom of the press. And there certainly are lots of cases, but there's not one particular case that really captures well this very complicated subject.
What books would you suggest that maybe somebody start with?
Well, I mean, there are very many different books that have been written on various aspects of freedom of the press. I particularly like books that kind of convey basically the facts.
Yes.
So there is, for example, that is to say, the facts being what the court has actually decided. There are interesting books that talk a lot about stories. There are interesting books that talk a lot about theory. But I'm particularly interested in books that basically say, here are the rules. And let me just find one. There is a book in the Understanding series, which is basically aimed at law students, but I think is accessible to everybody, called Understanding the First Amendment. It's an attempt to just kind of summarize what the legal rules are. And if you're interested in those legal rules, I think if you start with that book, that'll be a good place to start.
And I kind of heard you say that, the freedom of speech is that close cousin. We're talking about like the freedom of communication, the freedom of expression. So would it be fair to say like sometimes it's hard to just look at freedom of the press because it's so intertwined within the First Amendment and the ability to express yourself?
Sure. There are many court cases that even aren't really completely clear on whether they're applying the freedom of speech or freedom of the press. There are cases that talk about freedom of speech as just a stand-in for freedom of speech. Press, assembly, petition, all four are protected by the First Amendment. So yes, if you want to understand the law of freedom of the press, you should also understand the law of the freedom of speech.
Professor Volokh, thank you so much for giving us just a quick overview of freedom of the press. We really appreciate it.
Very much my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.